Great, so let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk through, we'll start with introductions. We'll talk through data management and what that means to your business case, and how to present data in the right way to the right audience. We will talk through visual communications and why that's important to be able to tell the right story. And lastly, we will end with becoming a data storyteller and tips and tricks on how to leverage storytelling through a data perspective. So we'll go ahead and get started with intros. My name is Natalie Bendroff. I am a project manager here at Catapult Systems. I have been here about 3.5 years on the data and AI team, and have worked on a variety of different projects in all industries and of all different sizes. So that is my quick intro. Edwin.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, my name is Ed Blake. I have been with Catapult for around 11 years, just under 11 years. My role is as a service designer in the data and AI group. A large part of what I do is to conduct the innovation workshops, which you may have heard about in the last session. Also, I'm co-chair of the industry advisory board for Austin Community College here in Austin for the visual communications department. So that's sort of my other job, if you will. Looking forward to presenting. Thank you.
Oh, Renee, you're on mute.
Sorry, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Renee Veloz. I am a data scientist and a business analyst for Catapult Systems. I've been with Catapult for about 2 years, working on various data projects. I have roughly 12 years of business analysis experience and experience in all things data. Look forward to presenting.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, they're checking it now.
Oh.
Thank you.
I think if you are not on mute, which please just go ahead and mute yourself. Thank you. Okay. All right. So data management. So there are a lot of business cases that really highlight good data management and data management that needs improvement. So I wanted to talk through one of the biggest cases in history around how data management was a big impact on a big project. And in this case, it was the Challenger. So to give you a little brief overview of what was going on in this project. So the goal that NASA had was to make access to space a routine matter. They wanted to identify a lower cost to get to space with a reusable and economical space shuttle. Now, in the early 80s, and they had wanted to schedule a record number of missions throughout the 80s, and specifically in 1986, there was a case to really put a lot of pressure on having launches. Every so often throughout 1986, in order to make a case for the budget, which, as you can see, was at least about 5.1 billion. So this is really important to know that the schedule was pretty tight, and there were many reasons why this project had failed, but part of the reason, was because of the overcommitting to a certain schedule and to make a case for the budget. So I just want to talk a little bit about what that day looked like. So the mission was to launch a tracking and data satellite. They were going to also track and observe Halley's Comet and conduct a set of lessons for the Teacher in Space program. So there were a couple days earlier in January in 1986 that were initially scheduled for takeoff, but they were delayed. So upon January 28th, 1986 was determined that that was going to be the final launch day. Initial scheduled liftoff was scheduled at 9:38. The liftoff happened about 2 hours later, and then 73 seconds later, there was an issue, and it was later determined that it was occurred through the solid rocket boosters, where the tragedy occurred and the space shuttle exploded in front of millions of Americans, and resulting in the death of all 7 crew members. So I just want to take a moment and just acknowledge the Challenger crew. You know, there was a variety of astronauts and mission commanders on here, but we also had a teacher. She was the first teacher up in space, Krista McCullough. And, you know, I just want to pay respects to the Challenger crew that really sacrificed their life for you know, for NASA to really figure out where they went wrong, and these were the people that had to suffer those consequences. So I do like this quote: "The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives." President Ronald Reagan. So I want to talk a little bit about what happened with the disaster and why the data that at hand was not presented properly, which ultimately resulted in this disaster. So I'm not going to get too technical with the terms, but ultimately the cause of the disaster was traced to an O-ring which sealed the right rocket booster. So all you really need to know is that the O-ring held segments of the motor together, and it essentially needed to seal all of the fuel in the rocket motor. And what had happened in this case was the O-ring had actually failed to seal, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why, essentially causing the explosion. After this disaster, President Reagan appointed a presidential commission to investigate why did this happen with everything that we knew. Why did such a disaster and a tragedy occur? During that commission report and during the investigation, Richard Feynman, a renowned physicist and Nobel laureate, he conducted a little experiment with the O-rings in front of the entire commission panel. What that experiment proved was that the O-rings did not expand quickly enough when they were in cold temperatures. At the time of liftoff, the Challenger, the day, you know, it was a really cold day. It was actually abnormally cold for that day in Florida. The temperature at liftoff was 32 degrees. NASA at the time said that the chance of failure, the chance of a problem with the shuttle was about 1 in 100,000. And after Richard Feynman conducted this experiment, he actually determined that the risk of failure was closer to 1 in 100. So now that you have a little bit of the history, I want to talk about the data analysis and why the data that was shown at the time could have been painted a little bit more clearly to present to the audience that they needed to present it to. So looking at this chart, observing the data that was available, it appears as if the temperature does not affect the O-ring experience. So you have the calculated joint temperature on the horizontal axis, and the number of incidents occurred with those flights. You can kind of see, you know, there were a couple flight incidents that occurred occurred higher at lower temperatures, but there's not really a correlation that you see here, just from this graph. Now, what they did not have was any data below 53 degrees. So that was another part of the issue, is that there weren't any launches that occurred below 53 degrees. So it was hard to make a case as to why the engineers did not recommend launching at less than 53 degrees, because they hadn't done it before. So now when you look at all of the data that they had at the time between the 24 launches that occurred prior to the January 28th incident, you can see here the green dots are successful flights that did not have any issues. The red are flights that did have incidents, and you can see that flights that have the more incidents, there is a relationship between the temperature, between the lower temperature and higher temperatures. And by painting this picture, by looking at the data, very in a different light, comparing the red to the green, really you're able to make a more conclusive inference. So I kind of covered that. Above 65 degrees, only 3 flights out of 20 had incidents, and below 65 degrees, all 4 flights had incidents. So this is an example of how relying on a sample set of data can really contribute to disastrous results. So I mentioned a lot about the data analysis, and I mentioned how there was a variety of different audiences that were going to need to make decisions based on the data at hand. This is an extremely high level communication chart that separated Thiokol Engineering, who were the manufacturers of the rocket, the solid rocket booster, and how they communicated to NASA. Now, I've been doing some research, and it was really interesting that some of the managers, so engineers base their risk assessment on their technical experience and facts, right? However, the managers were more inclined to take risk because they were a bit removed from the technical issues and due to the fact that their job was to ensure business proceeded without delays. So this leads me to the question, how would you tell the same story to the business that you would to the technical team, but in a different way? Would you talk to the same way to a scientist about the risks and the issues of, the same way that you would talk to the president or to the White House? Probably not. You need to adjust your story to make it work and to make the people at hand, to that target audience, for them to understand what it is you're presenting. Unfortunately, in this case, now the Thiokol engineers they were trying to escalate this risk as much as they could. They believed that there was a big danger, but there was not a method of, there wasn't a quantitative way to measure risk. So by them saying, I believe there's a danger at launching at colder temperatures, the managers were then saying, well, I believe there's a smaller danger, because there wasn't a really critical way of communicating that message with the data that they had at hand. So data should always be readable, it should be digestible and customized for your target audience. Now, that does not mean to reinterpret the data in a different way and paint the story to match what you're wanting to see. It really just means, how can you explain this data in a way that managers who don't understand or who don't have really a lot of insight into the technical side of things can understand it and understand those risks. And when you're talking to engineers, it's also the same thing. You're not going to talk to them in a managerial business way. You talk to them about more of the technical data and the details about that. So now I'm going to pass it over to Edwin to talk more about visual communication and how visual communication really impacts the story.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks very much for that great presentation. I really appreciate that. So yeah, if you go to the next slide. So I'd like to start with something that really is a throwback. This is from the mid 1800s, and I think this is recognized by many people as sort of the one of the best, if not the best, statistical graphics ever produced. It's used a lot in presentations for that reason. It portrays the losses suffered by Napoleon's army in the Russian campaign of 1812. So, it begins at the Polish-Russian border. It shows the thick band at the top, shows the army's position over time, and then the retreat, as you can see. And if you look at the black band underneath, we're talking about thousands of people being killed. So it's very, very heartfelt, very clear. And I think from a graphic perspective, it's notable that it represents in 2 dimensions, obviously, but it represents 6 types of data: the number of Napoleon's troops, the distance, the temperature, the latitude and longitude, the direction of travel, and the location relative to specific dates. So a lot of data in a 2-dimensional presentation, which frankly has not really been improved on from that time. It's flat. It has no extra accoutrements, which is one of the components that we're going to talk about as we go through the next few slides. Thanks, Natalie. So one of the sort of guiding principles along those same lines is to use the smallest effective difference to portray changes in data, if you will. So if you think in terms of thinner lines in gray rather than black, use of minimal distinctions of color to reduce visual fatigue. So if you look at the 2 images on the screen, you have a very overloaded image on the left that really has a lot of unnecessary accoutrements, additional colors, things that are not really necessary to just portray the depth of the sea, essentially. So the image on the right removes all of that. It shows what's totally necessary to show the data and nothing more. Another example of this would be if you're using a font and you want to emphasize something in a document. If you make it bold, if you make it red, if you make it italic, you've used 3 or 4 of the tools in your toolbox that you could then use to make an effective difference in the display. You've used them all up, so you can no longer use them for other areas of emphasis, if you will. So for many reasons, it's important to show the minimalist, smallest effective difference over time, or even with a static graphic, the way you see it here. So next slide, please, Natalie. Thank you. Back in, I believe this was the 90s, this graph was presented to the Lancet as a new way to display a graphical summary of patient data. One of the great things is it aggregated all of the things that I'm old enough to remember: a clipboard hanging on the bottom of a patient's bed with a sheaf of papers containing printouts, reports, all of that stuff that a doctor had to kind of skim through. So this was a pretty successful attempt back then of producing an assimilated single view of a lot of data in one place, but still in a very readable form and in a very minimalist form. There's virtually no color in this. It's easy to assimilate. Obviously here, this was a pixel perfect 8.5 by 11 sheet. That's really what we're talking about here. But if you look at this patient, this is a patient with a long and complex history with 2 medical and 2 psychiatric problems. And this, as the text here says, replaced over 11,000 cells and over 1,700 values, all in a very distinct and succinct display. Obviously, back then it was very much a printout or a single display, but changes, improvements have obviously been made since then. If we could go to the next slide, Natalie, and we'll just look at this one very briefly. Now, of course, in addition to what we saw on the last slide, we have predictive analysis, we have live data, we have AI, we have all of the other tools available to us now that really enable us to take that kind of display and then layer on top of it, obviously more information, hopefully still in a very readable form. But it was a huge step back then to aggregate, assimilate all of that content into one screen. Next one, please. Thank you. So one of the guiding principles, and I think this graphic displays it very, very well or very, very badly, depending on how you look at it. The proliferation, if you will, which I think has changed. I think people have really come away from this more recently, both in terms of applications and social media, all of the other things that we deal with on a daily basis. But if you look at this is a very, very overloaded display, if you will. So examples of the overloading would be, dark grid lines, unnecessary text, inappropriately complex and gimmicky fonts, graphics, extra graphics that really just, in this case, really take away from the data. The data should be clearly understood. There's really no need for any of these accoutrements other than perhaps keeping a graphic designer in business. But that's probably the only good reason there. So I think that's all I wanted to say about that one, Natalie, if you go to the next one. So one of the things along those lines, it's very important, excuse me, to obviously choose the right model. So if you think in terms of there are probably 28, 30 major ways of displaying data, primary ways, there really only maybe 4 or 5 of them are commonly used, and that's good. But choosing the right model to display your data is vitally important. If you look at these two, that obviously the truth is self-evident that you know, the one on the left, this is not the model that you should use to display this. There are a number of other ways that you could do this that will be easier to display, more clear, or it could just be broken apart. You could use sort of progressive disclosure to show certain parts of this. Obviously, this person wanted to show everything in one display, and within that, really, that was where they fell down. That really, it's so obviously overloaded that it's impossible to assimilate the data, to understand really what's going on. And then the one on the other side is obviously a much plainer, much simpler kind of display of the same in the same way, but obviously that is probably the best way to display that data. There may be other ways, but just to compare those two, you can see that one works and one doesn't. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is just something for the record when you guys get this presentation, really just a reference to choosing the right model. And I wasn't going to dwell on this one any longer than that, Natalie. Thank you. So again, if we get to animation, you know, animation in this case is unnecessary. If you look at the animation, it brings nothing to the display other than rotation, which in and of itself doesn't add any value. It actually clouds the data display. The axes at the bottom are hard to read when it rotates. So it actually takes away from the ability to assimilate the data. But again, this is an example of an animation that really doesn't bring anything to the table. It's really just somebody's probably spent a significant amount of time to animate this to really not bring any value. So I think you know, there are other much better other ways. This one, just an example I found. The animation does its job. It displays changes over time. Very good use of animation. It shows a statistical readout. Again, very valuable. There are many other ways to do this. There are many out there now that are actually pretty much overwrought. Again, for all of the reasons that if you go back to the chart junk example, that really are overwrought examples. But this one is, in my mind, this is just enough. It's just enough to show the data in a useful way over time, and really does its job as opposed to the previous one. Thanks, Natalie. I'd like to end with an example. Somebody recently introduced an interactive version of our the graphic that we started with. I really like this idea. It's not, again, overwrought. It has a lot of value. The sliding that Natalie's showing you right now offers a readout at the bottom, so it brings a lot of data points without a lot of interaction. Certainly that. There's a rollover at the top to change from the French to an English translation, which I think again has value. So it's enough. It brings value to the animation, to the interaction, without being overwrought, without overloading it, and just, as I say, just generally brings a lot of value to the interaction, just enough. So to end where we started with this great graphic, thanks very much for your time. I'd like to hand things over to Renee. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Edwin. Thanks, Natalie, for those great presentations. So far, both Ed and Natalie have talked about creating messages based on data. We've discussed crafting those messages for different types of audiences. And we talked about providing clear, meaningful visualizations that are free from unnecessary chart element and stuff like that. So how do we tie those pieces together? Slide, please. So we do that using a technique known as data storytelling. So I'm going to switch off my camera here. I'm a little worried about bandwidth. So as you know, what is data storytelling? So first off, have it on the slide. It's the process of creating a story out of data analysis findings, which allows non-technical audiences or business people anyone really, to gain insight and use them to make decisions or take actions. So as more organizations are using big data, this data storytelling has become more important. Data is really complicated, and data insight, it's supposed to be communicated in a way that's easy for everyone to understand. And the easiest way to communicate that information is to craft a story. So we use visuals to represent the data to help the story come to life. I want to direct your attention to that. There's the visual on the right, and this is a visual that's actually from Forbes, and it talks about how we use narrative visuals and data to explain the data to our data consumer, to engage them, enlighten them, and then drive change. So when the stakeholders are engaged and the insights emerge, it prompts the stakeholder to make decisions or drive change. You see in the meetings the light bulbs going off. So the goal here is to have a data story that influences and drives change. Now, there are different types of stories that can be told with data. So reporting stories, explanatory stories. So your reporting stories are more your snapshots. Explanatory stories are, just those explaining behaviors of certain types of data. Predictive stories where we're using historical data to look at trends or projections of what we think is going to happen in the future. Causation stories, which are evaluating cause and effects of different elements, and then correlation stories, which talk about how two elements can be correlated, or two activities can be correlated. Slide, please. So who is a data storyteller? So a data storyteller is a person who reviews data, processes it to understand what it means to a particular stakeholder group, and communicates insights in story form. It's important to note here that data storytellers are not only data scientists. They're business analysts, managers, your data analysts, your business partners, anybody who's reviewing the data and analyzing it, and is able to form a story about it so that stakeholders can understand. These are your data storytellers. And the goal of a storyteller is to guide users to help make logical decisions based on that data. So storytellers often are your SMEs, and they've got to understand the data as well as the impacts it has on the different business groups, different departments, different processes within an organization. So these are really important. Slide, please. So why is data storytelling so important? So first, data storytelling is important because stakeholders don't always understand the outcome of analytics, but they still need to know about the data. They still need the data to make some sort of decision. And in order for people to understand it, it needs to be put into human context and translation. So also, analytics alone can't prompt stakeholders to make decisions. Data alone can cause confusion if it doesn't contain like real language or visuals. The storytelling kind of helps communicate the findings quick and clear in story form. And third, it's just often hard for stakeholders to look at all of the data at once and get the insights on their own. A lot of times people are overwhelmed by data. Not everyone enjoys data as much as we do. So they don't have access to it on a regular basis, and they're not used to looking at it. So the storytellers usually take that job, and they start to tell data and make it relevant to real life problems, and make the data consumers understand how it impacts them. So how can we structure the data storytelling process with data. A couple of steps here. So number one is understanding the business problem. So we're in this step, we're defining the question at hand and trying to figure out why it matters to the big business. Knowing what problems the organization is trying to solve, is going to help everyone make the story relevant to the audience. Secondly, as I mentioned before, understanding the business environment, understanding who your stakeholders are, and what roles they play in the organization, being familiar with the business environment, and understanding how the data that you're trying to deliver impacts those business activities. Third, identify any roadblocks to acceptance or understanding proposed solutions. So this one is a little challenging sometimes because first, as Natalie mentioned in her part of the presentation, each audience has a slightly different story. So each stakeholder could have its own interests. But when you review data or process or solutions or anything with your team, you just need to make sure that everyone's on the same page with the same goals, and make sure that everyone understands the business problem that's trying to be solved, that they are reviewing the data, and reviewing the proposed solution with the same end goal in mind. And we just want to make sure that those steps and goals are clear. The adapt the story to fit your audience. I think that one is self-explanatory. This one is if you're talking to a technical team, then you want to speak to them in technical terms. If you're talking to someone who is in supply chain, you will want to use their language, and you'll adapt data to kind of fit the story that you want to tell. And present the business impact of the solution as a story end. So this one is really important, and it's the most important of all the steps, I believe. But making sure that that solution is impactful and that it's presented as such, and make sure that it relates to a goal, a future vision of the company, and that it can, or it doesn't have to be a future vision of the company. It can be also tied to something that's already happened, right? But as long as that it is shown as impactful. Slide, please. So what kinds of data storytellers can they present? Here, there are different types of analyses that are usually done that you could be presenting. You could be presenting lots of types of data, but here are 4 main types. So descriptive analysis. So this is outlining this is outlining data and describing what's happening. This is actually snapshots. So these are your KPIs, your revenue, your sales leads. Diagnostic analysis is explaining why something happened. So taking a look at your descriptive analysis and explaining why things are happening here. Your predictive analysis, which is one we're really mostly familiar with. So using historical data to project or predict something that will happen in the future. And then prescriptive analysis, which is using a combination of those 3 types of analyses to form a plan of action to face the issue or decision that a business wants to make. So a simple example of that last one would be visuals showing sales for various marketing campaigns over a period. And the organization may see that sales increased in a month and use the diagnostic analysis to determine, why and which marketing campaigns contributed the most. And then they would use predictive analysis to predict the next year's revenue based on the data that they already have. So in this way, the organization can make data-driven choices. Slide, please. So how do we present our findings and visuals in a way that's clear, concise, and impactful? So we tie everything we know about data storytelling to this situation, problem, solutions, next steps framework. The acronym is SPSN. and it's been used by Robert Young in his digitalization strategy and transformation team. He found and he suggested that when you are presenting a case to the business, that you should do it in 4 slides. So the 4 slides are listed on the left: situation, problem, solution, and next steps. And everything in the right column are the steps that the data storyteller should take to make sure that that information is presented on those slides. And let's talk a little bit about those. So the situation, assess the current state and situation. We kind of talked about that already, identifying your audience, your stakeholder, and what does the situation look like. And then find a problem that needs solving. So outlining the pain points and looking at key metrics that are important to the stakeholders. And then getting relevant data and validating that data with the business partners in the problem part. In the solution, you're analyzing those data findings. You're creating the clear, meaningful visualizations, and you're presenting the storyline according to framework with solutions. In the final step, the final slide, you're gathering feedback from the stakeholders and the data consumers, and you're allowing them to guide the solution, review your data findings, and find out if there are any other actions that can be taken. Because the solutions can come in many forms, it can be an implementation of a new system, a new application, it can be business process changes, new tools. We start to look at this and say, well, this process is iterative. It's a continuous improvement. So another challenge will present itself after we implement this solution. So this is the time for the data consumer to have input and pretty much start this process all over again. So let's look at this in practice and take a look at, what would 4 slides look like presenting a business, presenting using the framework of SPSN. So my apologies, this slide and the next slide should be combined, but one of the visual was very, very large, so it wouldn't fit on one slide. But basically, the situation would be that hacks and data leaks have affected many businesses in the U.S. So we're hearing about attacks on major companies. Small businesses and large businesses are both targeted, and so your organization can be targeted. And you can hit the slide, please. And so here, this is really small for me to see. I'm going to try to blow this up on my own screen. So here, this is a really great infographic that talks about hacking statistics in the US. So you can see, oh, wow, I'm going to try to blow this up. 80% of US businesses were hacked. And then it says, sorry, it's really, really tiny.
Oh, is there a way, do you want me to get out of the presentation mode and zoom in?
No, you know what, I can pull it on my own. Just give me 1 sec to do so. Apologize. Because I kind of want to step through these one by one. So the 80% of surveyed U.S. businesses have been hacked. So we're presenting the situation in a clear way. We're saying 3/4 of Americans have been the victim of some sort of cybercrime, and we're saying 77.5% of all of those happened in a particular time frame, right? And we're seeing that in the first infographic. And then underneath, it kind of gives you different statistics on the different types of attacks that are there. So ransomware attacks were 57%, made up 57% of that number. And then let's see, then 71% of those targeted by ransomware were successfully infected in 2016. So each of these is kind of quantifying what the attacks look like in the US. Same with phishing attacks. Talks about 85% of respondents have been the victim of a phishing attack, and 30% of phishing emails are opened. 90% of phishing emails carried some kind of ransomware. It also goes on to talk about gaining access and what that looks like in the future. So it talks about predicting that cybercrime will cost $6 trillion globally by 2021, which is this year, which is double the $3 trillion it was responsible for in 2015. So those are obviously things to be concerned about as an organization. So what does your problem look like? Slide, please. So in this case, you would look at what it looks like for your own organization. For this ABC company, it's showing the cyber attacks over 5 years having been increasing, mostly. So for internal misuse, it's kind of increasing a little, and then you've got your phishing attacks declined sometime in 2019. Same with your, hold on just one second. It's so hard to see. I've got an increase in it's DDoS attacks. Yeah, and so the malware is increasing it has an increasing trend. And if you were going to talk about each one of those as a vertical, you could use the visualization on the right to look at malware alone. So you would be in this problem part of the slide, you would be explaining to your data consumer about where you think you need to focus your attention, right? So let's say it's malware. So slide, please. So then in the third slide, we talk about proposed solutions. And for these particular problems, or for this particular business case, the proposed solutions were predictive analytics. So these could be used to find out what cyber attacks look like and see when they might happen again. You can use this information to apply different types of security protocols to stop the attacks. Also backing up data, so you can implement or strengthen a backup or disaster recovery plan, or maybe if you don't have one, this is a time to kind of put one together. Service level agreements. So this is a lot of the data is managed by third parties, sometimes in corporations. So you would include some sort of stipulation of breaches in the contracts as you're doing them, so maybe give you some protection. Another protection method used is cyber insurance. So organizations can insure themselves financially to protect themselves and any of their data partners. And finally, the most important and what we see a lot is the training and awareness. So this is just training your employees and engaging them to employ in the best practices to prevent data exposure, cyber attacks, prevent all of the phishing emails, things like that, clicking on bad links. So slide, please. So the last slide, which is the fourth slide, would be your next step slide, where you would allow the business stakeholders to discuss those solutions that you presented and prioritize them. So you'd want to evaluate, first off, do they address the causes of the problems? What are your plans for this? How much does it cost to do this? What's the scale look like? How can we evaluate the solution? How easy can they be implemented? And from here, you would create an action plan. So this is the ideal way and the easiest way to tell a data story and use it to create this iterative process of being able to continuously solve challenges, right? So go ahead, slide, please. So as a last point, the general guidelines in building a story, and Natalie mentioned this at the very top of the presentation, data analytics, it should only be associated with a question. You don't want to go into analyzing data with some kind of objective, right? We hear those horror stories of, for example, the intern working in the financial department, oh, sales should be 350 million this year. You make sure that report says that. This is the kind of situations we want to avoid. So data is there to be explored. It's not there to create any you don't need to create any bias in it. So next is create narratives only after obtaining analysis results. So we only want to create stories after we've looked at all the data and we've discussed that with the business, kind of visualized it. I'm sorry, not visualized it. After we validated it and made sure that with the business partner that we have the right data and that we can explain any abnormalities, any anomalies, or sometimes any events that might be happening in the data. We just want to make sure that we have all of that and we have documented that in our analyses. And then finally, validating data and insights with stakeholders before. Okay, so I just went over that. But yeah, so this is building the story, the general guidelines, and these are, I guess this is not in the form of do's and don'ts, but they are. This is important to know. And I will end here and open up for questions on any of these slides or any of these processes. I think I heard a question.
Thanks, Renee. Thanks, Edwin. Do we have any questions for the team, for us, on any point in this conversation or on these topics? Well, if not, we can end a little bit early. We do have a survey that we would love for you to complete, and then you'll be eligible for a Amazon gift card. So we would love to hear how we did. This is the final presentation of our data summit. So thank you all so much for joining today. And if you've attended other sessions, we really appreciate it. Is Sam on, or did anyone else want to make any closing remarks?
I'll jump in, Natalie.
Sure.
Everybody who's on the call still, thank you so much for joining us the last couple of days. I hope you've gotten something out of the sessions, and please be looking for emails from us. We will have take a little time to put them all together into a fashion that'll be easier to access all of the recordings. So in a week or so, we'll have all of these ready to go and queued up for you so that you can access them at your leisure. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.